Left of the box. Recently, news kind of exploded out of BC, that is British Columbia, the province where Lance from the Surf is the unknown prince, that the NDP, so that's supposed to be the progressive parties in Canada, both federally and provincially. They're supposed to be like the most left-leaning party, has now declared that they're going to force people into treatment for drug addiction. And that sounds bad enough already, but it's so much worse than just what I said. Because this isn't just for people who are addicted to drugs, it's also people with brain damage or mental health issues. And so suddenly, this little umbrella as to who they can force into treatment is getting slightly bigger and slightly bigger. It's not just one group of people, but it's all these different groups of people that they don't want to have to deal with as a society because it actually takes effort and work and policy. They just want to clean them up and shove them away. So the fact that it was the NDP that put this policy through is disgusting. So this is from Mayor Ken Sim, today joined by Premier David Eby and a couple Indigenous bands that I can't pronounce, as the province government announced the introduction of mandatory care, marking a first step towards addressing the mental health and addictions crisis. For too long, our most vulnerable have been falling through the cracks without readily accessible services. This marks a new chapter for care and compassion. Compassion in our province. This is just the beginning. More to come tomorrow. So that's how it started. And then things like mandatory care. In some of the articles, the mandatory got changed to the word secure. That's because, as we will go over, a lot of these places that they will be sending these people to are literal prisons. And so Critical Criminology is just replying to the NDP statement that they sent out about this, saying you are literally jailing people. There's no compassion or evidence behind this. Crass, cruel political opportunism, nothing else. Social Democrats pushing social murder. And this is the statement. We want to help people get the care they need and help families be whole again while keeping communities safe. With compassion and evidence as our guide, we're launching Dignified Secure, there's that secure word, for those with brain injuries, mental health illness, and severe addiction. Who gets to determine this? The mental health? Who gets to determine how bad the brain injury has to be before they get into this secure location? How bad, what is a severe addiction compared to a mild addiction? What would be the difference there? Where is the metric? Where is the cutoff? And this is the statement from David Eby: safer for you and your community and safer people who need secure care. Real action to help you with secure care. And they want to say that they used evidence as our guide. No, they didn't. This is not based in evidence. In fact, this is the polar opposite of what the evidence suggests that it should happen. Same thing when here in Ontario, when Doug Ford closed 10 of the 17 supervised consumption sites. That goes against what the evidence says you should do. And so here again is the BC NDP trying to claim evidence when the evidence shows this is the worst thing you can do. You can't force people into treatment. It doesn't work. The relapse rate of people who are forced into treatment is in the 90s. And to just take away people's autonomy like that, there has to be a wide range of options of treatment. There has to be mental health care in this country. There has to be social issues being taken care of, like issues with the housing and wages and all these other things that need to be dealt with in tandem, along with, the help with the addictions and things of that sort. You can't just force people into treatment, then shove them back into the same environments, which started a lot of their addictions to begin with. And so here is from CTV News Vancouver. Critics slam BC's Premier's involuntary care. Is that what we're calling it? Involuntary, but it's care. Announcement, cite lack of evidence. So here they're saying evidence as our guide. But here, the critics are citing a lack of evidence.
This comes on the heels of the Premier's push toward involuntary care, announcing a new care facility for people with addiction and mental health issues. And it's getting blowback from both sides. Political opponents accuse David Eby of doing an about-face, while others claim there is a lack of evidence and worry it will only cause more harm. Here's CTV's Isabella Zavarisi.
This is one of the sites for a dedicated mental health unit on the grounds of the Alouette Correctional Centre in Maple Ridge.
Alouette Correctional Centre. In other words, a prison. And we'll get to another video where a woman does a beautiful breakdown of what all this means. And it turns out the Alouette Correctional Centre is the only women prison in BC.
Its purpose, involuntary care for people with addiction and mental health issues.
That we cannot wait. This is a group of people that need intensive interventionist support. They are not able to ask for help for themselves.
The Premier says the move is in response to overlapping issues, mental illness, brain injuries, and addiction.
So where do people go for the mental health issues? Where? Because what a lot of people have been pointing out here is that instead of focusing on this forced care, you need to have voluntary care available, because there's so many people that are desperate for care, looking for care, only to find there's nothing around, nothing for them.
Instead of being released into the community, people can now be moved into these facilities without their consent.
They will not benefit from voluntary treatment.
Critics believe otherwise, pointing to a lack of evidence, particularly for those who use substances.
Forced treatment, it just doesn't have the promise that we hope that it does. And it sets it up for so much risk for overdose, for severing connections. And it's not going to get us where we need to go.
A Vancouver writer who was treated for substance.
Some of the things that I've seen pointed out is, for one thing, when you're forced into this care, you're forced to go just be completely off. And that can actually send a person's body into shock and can kill them. The other thing is that these programs are about 2 months long. So during that time, the people will quite often lose a tolerance for the drugs that they were taking. So then when they're released and they go to take these drugs again, because again, this forced treatment doesn't actually solve the root causes of the addiction. And so for a lot of people, the first thing they do when they get out is go back to their old habits, especially if they're returned to the exact same environment that they were pulled from. So they've lost a lot of their tolerance, but they don't necessarily know that, which means a lot of people end up overdosing and dying as soon as they get out of these treatment centers.
Use on her own terms, agrees.
There are times, absolutely, where interventions are required. The mandatory care that they're talking about is, I don't think is not going to work and is very problematic in terms of civil liberties.
The BCCLA was pretty concerned about this announcement. We think it's infringing on people's rights in a way that's not acceptable.
Eby's announcement drew accusations from his opponents. The leader of BC's Conservatives saying, quote, "This kind of flip-flopping only demonstrates a lack of leadership and vision."
I like that. The flip-flopping. is the issue. The lack of leadership and vision, because he's flip-flopping on that. Whereas the conservatives are like, oh no, we absolutely want to do this. We've always been, that's exactly what they've always wanted. But this NDP leader has been flip-flopping on what he wants. But we're totally down for this.
And vision. Those who question the policy say greater investments in housing would be a better alternative.
Safe and secure housing was pivotal to my recovery.
There's no timeline on when these mental health facilities will be up and running, but the Premier says the plan is to move forward as quickly as possible. Isabella's
Yeah, let's just move as quickly as possible before we find out what all the risks are. How about that? Before we do any more research, because if we do any more research, we might find out that, this is a bad idea. So let's just do it first and deal with the consequences later. And then here's Guy Felicia said, it didn't have to be this way. And he's been very outspoken about this. I came across him on Twitter not too long ago when I was covering what was happening here in Ontario. And he has his story is he almost died 6 times from overdoses, but he was saved because of things like supervised consumption sites. And because he made it through those periods in his life, he got to a place now where he's healthy, he's addiction-free, he has a family, children, all those things that would have never happened had he not had the services he needed when he needed them. And so there's going to be so many more people who need these services that a lot of them now won't even necessarily go and seek them out. If you're in BC, because if you're in BC and you have an issue with addiction and you want help, but you want a certain type of help, you want to go to a supervised consumption site, you might now be afraid to do that because you're worried you're going to be tossed in to one of these, secure care locations, that you're going to be ripped off of the street and thrown into prison. They're literal prisons. So this actually discourages people from seeking help. So he says, I read today's news release about the plan to introduce secure care for people with brain injuries, mental health illness, and severe addiction. The release says it intended to support the growing population, emphasis mine, of people with severe addictions, brain injuries from related drug poisonings combined with mental health disorders and psychosis. The thing is that there has been a growing crisis. You should be dealing with the root cause of why that is happening. And a lot of it, again, it's not like it's a mystery. We know. It's housing. It's the cost of living. It's lack of access to mental health care. It's lack of access to health care that's causing these problems. You don't get to then just look at what the end result is and punish people for, turning to drugs as an escape, as a diversion, as a coping mechanism, when all these other things in their lives, the things that would have kept them stable and happy, have been stripped away from them. He says, what would have been better? Not letting organized crime poison people in the first place. If we had implemented regulation, a real nanny state system of rules and controls for opioids people seek, so we could have cut organized crime out. So he's basically talking about legalizing all drugs, stop new users and kids from trying them, and preventing brain injuries from happening in the first place, we wouldn't be in the position, and many people would still be alive and or uninjured. One day in the distant future, society will figure out that moralizing over substance use, just some substances, while some are deemed okay, was not worth all the death and destruction, and they will look back at these decisions and will think we are all a bunch of complete morons. And so here's a little video clip of Guy Felicia actually talking about this. And this is from Mo Amir. The BC NDP government pulled harm reduction kiosks from Vancouver Island hospitals after conservative outrage, but at what cost? So this isn't just the first thing the BC NDP has done. There was also these little kiosks people could go to get clean needles, clean crack pipes and stuff. But there was outrage from the conservatives, so the NDP buckled. So the conservatives are like, oh no, they're flip-flopping, wink, wink. But they're actually happy because the NDP is just falling for what the conservatives want. You know, they're just buckling to the conservatives.
For us, with substance use, when people are using these facilities or accessing these services, if they don't have clean supplies, then they will use dirty supplies. And then these health complications can come and really be a challenge.
What sort of health complications are we talking about if people are using quote unquote dirty inhalation kits or dirty, snorting kits for cocaine?
Well, you can get cracks in your mouth, blood to blood contact with another individual. You get Hep C, HIV. So, and then it's like, so here's the thing, you can hand out a $2.50 bag of supplies, or you can spend, $250,000 in later on in life health complications on an individual.
Yeah. That's preventative care 101. And it's not just for people who use drugs, it's for everyone. Like, again, we need full universal health care that includes vision, hearing, physiotherapy, mental health care, all of it. Because if you prevent them from getting worse, it's so much cheaper and affordable for the country to deal with it before it becomes a crippling problem. And it's the same with dental care, because now that there's that means-tested dental care for seniors, the dentists are horrified at what they're coming across, because people have left it off so much that by the time, they basically can no longer chew, the cost is so much more. Whereas if they had just been able to get that cavity filled back then, get that cleaning filled back then, get this little issue looked at way back when it would have cost barely anything. People left that off because they couldn't afford it. And now it's causing thousands to tens of thousands for an individual. And it's the same with this. Like, if people were just given proper treatment from the beginning, had supervised consumption sites, as he was saying, getting rid of the gangs that are involved with drugs by, decriminalizing them so that they could be regulated and stuff, so many more people would be alive today, and there wouldn't be such a strain on the healthcare system for when it finally gets to the point where there's no other choice, but they have to go to an ER or something of that sort.
So then why don't the BC NDP just say, hey, these things that the conservatives are rallying against, if the conservatives had their way, you would actually have outbreaks of hepatitis C or HIV or other infectious diseases. Why don't they just say that?
You know what? That's the $1 million question that I keep asking. It's like, we already have 30 years of evidence that these reduce multiple health costs in our society. And so, this is why they're there. And, taking them away will just make it extremely worse.
Now, the BC Conservatives also say that by distributing these, they call it drug paraphernalia, but basically these harm reduction supplies, by distributing these, the government, the province, is actually enabling addiction. So let me ask you, if someone doesn't have access to these supplies to consume drugs, don't they just stop using drugs then because they don't have the harm reduction supplies?
That was a bit of sarcasm there. And I pointed that out in my last live stream as well. It's like, the conservatives' belief on how you can cure the drug issues is by, not supplying clean needles and crack pipes, not having supervised consumption sites, and making all hard drugs illegal, which they currently are. You see, if you do all of that, then there won't be a drug problem anymore in the country. And that's what conservatives seem to think would magically happen. Instead, what it just does is lead to a lot more illness and death and despair and discarded needles on the street. And yeah.
No, because
that's what the conservatives are saying.
Well, if you take away a hospital, do people get sick?
I think they probably do.
Now, this is a really good TikTok that also breaks it down, and I didn't know who this person was, so I did look her up because, again, I get wary just randomly like, oh, here's a TikTok that seems informative. I'm just going to believe it with no research or anything. I do, I have reliable sources on Twitter that I tend to go to, as well as like government officials, reporters, things of that sort, that I tend to use their tweets and stuff. But when I come across something new, I like to learn a little bit about them first. And she has a webpage. So she is a Vancouver criminal lawyer that does these TikToks. So this is definitely in her line of work, and she knows a lot about it and has a really good video on it.
There is so much to be angry about these days, but the thing that's got me riled up today is the provincial NDP government announcing involuntary care for people who have brain injuries, for people who have addictions, and for people who have mental health conditions that are not willing to go into treatment. So basically, if you're not willing to choose a pathway to treatment, they're going to force you to do it.
And who gets to choose again? This has happened in the past, and all that happens is certain groups of people are targeted. You know, other people are afraid to come out and acknowledge that they're struggling with something. You know, it's used as a manipulation technique. Somebody on Twitter that I know was mentioning that once their family forced them into a treatment center way back when, and then after that, they would threaten to put her back in there if she didn't do exactly what they told them to do. And, you know, I've had a family member try to force me into some sort of care for my mental health. But the thing was, is at the time that they wanted that, I was actually doing okay. Like I had just gotten a job and things of that sort. But what they were doing was projecting their own issues onto me. And so that type of thing where you can force other people into this, it gets abused from the get-go. And it's been shown over and over again in history that that's exactly what happens.
And it's not just that they're going to force you into treatment and deny you your constitutionally protected right to autonomy about your body and about your mental health, and your right not to be arbitrarily detained, and your rights not to be discriminated against on the basis of your mental health or your disability if it's a brain injury or an addiction. Not only is that completely contrary to all of those constitutional rights that people have, but where the NDP is announcing they're going to create these 400 mental health beds is shocking. Some of them are going to be created at Surrey Pretrial Centre. And if you're not a criminal defense lawyer that practices in the Lower Mainland of British Columbia, you probably don't know that Surrey Pretrial Centre is a place where people do not get help for their mental health. It doesn't have mental health facilities, but it is also overcrowded. It is understaffed and under-resourced.
So yeah, let's just go to a place that's not designed to handle people with mental health crises and addiction issues. Let's just go and cram them all into this overcrowded prison. It's almost akin to, you know, we have people that, like, we need to open up hospital beds in hospitals. So let's just take those people who are in the hospital already and shove them into long-term care homes that are already overcrowded and understaffed. Now we'll just double them up, triple them up, quadruple them up to a room or something.
Creating more mental health beds there and increasing the population of people that are in Surrey pretrial without increasing all of the corresponding resources is only going to do a disservice to the people who are there who aren't involuntarily detained. It's going to take resources away from people who are already not getting what they need. And because it's a pretrial center, it's used for people who aren't even guilty of the crimes they're accused of. Meaning these people who have mental health issues, addictions, or brain injuries, who are accused of criminal offenses but not yet found guilty and are being held in pretrial detention, are then being streamed into involuntary care without the involvement of a judge to determine their entitlement to bail, because the government has determined that they're mentally ill and they need to be locked up to protect themselves.
Like I was saying, like, who gets to determine who is mentally ill and all this sort of stuff? And then this just goes back to, again, this country has a really bad history with eugenics, you know, where it's like, oh, these people that we consider to be mentally ill, we're just going to sterilize them. Why does the government get to determine that over a person as opposed to a health professional that can actually be like, okay, this person is or isn't a risk to themselves? You know, to just take away people's ability to choose what happens to their body, to choose what kind of treatment they go into. Because we've seen how bad this government, the Canadian government, can get when they start dictating these types of terms. Because even into the 2010s, there were cases of Indigenous women being sterilized without their consent.
This is bonkers. The second location where these are going to be put is Alouette Women's Institution, the only women's prison in British Columbia. This is awful. This is awful. And I heard somebody attempting to justify this on the radio today by saying, well, you know, we lock up people who have dementia, so we should be able to lock up people who have mental illness and brain injury. The problem is significantly different between locking up people with dementia and locking up people who have mental illness and brain injury. And that is capacity to make your own decisions. The people with dementia who end up in involuntary care in locked facilities are people who have dementia to a degree that they are incapable of looking after themselves, incapable of making decisions. That is very different. They don't have the ability to exercise autonomy. Whereas with people who have addiction, people who have brain injury, people who have mental health conditions, they still have the autonomy and the ability to make decisions. It's just that the government doesn't like the decisions that they're making.
And that is a really, really good distinction and point right there. You know, it's just the government doesn't like the decisions that you're making, but you know, because a lot of people will use the whole dementia thing, or like we lock up certain types of people with certain types of mental health issues. But it's a good distinction to make that, you know, the people that do get locked up are people who fundamentally can't make choices anymore because of their dementia or their mental health issue, versus people who can make choices. It's one the family doesn't like, or it's one that the city doesn't like, or the government doesn't like because it's a hassle, it's a burden. It's not what they want them to do. They need to conform in order to function in the society that we want them to function in. And so we just want to like take away these people who refuse to conform to our standards and get rid of them so we don't have to deal with them anymore, as opposed to giving them the individualized treatment that they deserve.
Or some doctor or psychiatrist who's assessing them doesn't like the decisions that they're making. That is very different. People are entitled to make decisions you don't agree with. And we have a criminal justice system if those decisions involve criminal activity that can assist with that. And if those decisions involve the use of drugs, we have some addictions treatment in this province, and we should be spending more money on making more voluntary addictions and mental health treatment available to people who want it. Because when people have access to those resources, when there is no difficulty obtaining those resources, people will get to a point where they are ready to access those resources and they will access them. But creating barriers and making it an involuntary committal for an indefinite period of time, that's not the answer. And we're not going to lock people up to get out of the addictions crisis.
We have to deal with the root causes why people are turning to the drugs in the first place. So I have here another, it's a tweet thread from Sarah Jama. Again, she's just so great on so many of the issues. I wish she could be prime minister. Party politics, parliamentary system won't allow it. She can't just run to be president of Canada, unfortunately. Anyway, a tweet thread from Sarah Jama, who is just like one of the best politicians we have in this country. And she's replying to Fred here, who is proud Hamiltonian, 12 years as mayor, 10 years as a councillor. And he's quote tweeting the Bay Observer saying British Columbia to institute compulsory treatment for persons with mental illness and addiction. And he's saying this is the beginning of a way forward. People with severe mental health and addiction issues are not capable of making informed decisions on their health and well-being. It must be done by the province with funding assistance from the federal government. Again, who gets to determine that? Who gets to determine what severe mental health is? Like, do I qualify? My mental health is so bad, I'm on disability. So does that mean I lose all right to autonomy, all right to make my own decisions? Because I can't function in society the way that somebody like him wants me to? I can't conform to, to do the jobs that this guy thinks I should be doing. And so Sarah's quote tweeting him saying, warehousing people without consent isn't the way forward. Funding for treatment options is. There was a time in Canada disabled children and people were forcibly sent to institutions like this and were physically, emotionally, sexually abused. This approach paves the way for experimental treatment, forced sterilization, medical racism, indentured slavery, and more. These forced programs were created under the guise of better treatment for sick people. The last institution like it closed in 2009. Trudeau even apologized for the human rights violations. And Sarah has, I believe she studied this specifically in university. Like, she knows this. I've watched a talk she gave on this that was just super powerful and emotional. So this is something like she is well aware of. She knows the history. This isn't her just thinking these things happen. She knows the pattern. She knows the history of this country. So she says, I understand how hard it is to watch people you love struggle, but lack of autonomy is how we ended up with legislation like the Alberta Sterilization Act. We must offer treatment without pathologizing homelessness. We must take care of people in community without hiding them away. Who decides who is addicted enough or disabled enough to be sent away? How will institutions like this impact working class people over affluent community members with the same struggles as a wider support network? What will keep policing institutions from weaponizing referrals? What about religious accommodations for those who don't view their mental health struggle as an illness? If someone refuses treatment, will they be forced to receive treatment? If someone prefers one treatment over another, will their voice matter? What rights do families have? Again, these are all things that, David Eby just wants to rush into this without accounting for all of these questions. He just wants to get this done as quickly as possible so they don't see how much of a horrid decision this is. Because if he were to try to answer any of these questions, it would show him for the ass he is. She continues, overall, I'm not convinced that this is the way of approaching mental health or addictions in community. Overall, I'm not convinced that this way of approaching mental health or addictions in community is the way forward. As the cost of living crisis has worsened, so too have the conditions of our most vulnerable community members. The solution is to fund treatment and housing options. This is known. We know how to solve this problem. We just have a lack of political will.